welcome. We're excited to have you join us today for a discussion about alumni participation beyond U.S. News rankings. One of the great interesting topics for those of us who have been in advancement. It is a popular topic in discussion over the years, and which may be evolving over time. With that in mind, we're going to jump to the next slide here, and let me introduce you to myself and our group here. I'm Mark Marshall, one of the principals here and the president of Philanthropic Council. Glad to have you here, and I'm joined by my colleagues, James Barnard, who leads our annual giving program. Want to say a quick hi, James?
Yeah, hi everyone. Great to be here today. Looking forward to this discussion.
Great. And our colleague, Michelle Green, who's one of our great campaign consultants. Michelle?
Hi, nice to see everybody today. So great to see so many familiar names coming up in the chat. Welcome, and hopefully we'll have a great hour together.
Great. And well, we have a great team here, and this will be a good discussion. And again, I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A sessions here, so feel free as we go to throw questions in as we go in the Q&A, and we may throw them in there as we go, but we may jump in and may hold them till the end. So, this has been a big shift. So as we think about it, the U.S. News and World Report rankings, I spent 20 years of my career at institutions, and we always waited for them to come out. You paid attention to where you were ranked. There's lots of jokes that go with all the institutional rankings. But let's be honest, they caused a lot of institutional pride. People would be proud to tell you what they were ranked. It was a external validation of where you ranked as an institution, and people would talk about their organization and where it ranked. It was a regional. It was the med school, the law school, this, that. But there was a sense of institutional pride, and it really played on that competitiveness of all of us, so that when U.S. News announced that they were de-emphasizing them, it really created some challenges for people. It reminds me a little bit of when planned giving used to always talk about the tax law, that people should give for tax law, and equally annual giving was always, you should give because of the rankings. And suddenly they took the tax law away, and planned giving didn't know what to do with itself for a little while, because that was a lead punch of every of all the estate tax letters and appeals. So equally annual giving is going to face some interesting challenges ahead. So with that in mind, we're going to jump through this a little bit more. But Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give some additional shape and maybe some context to our conversation today, we wanted to ask all of you how this shift is impacting your shop, your institution, your work on a daily basis. So I'm going to slide this question over here just a smidge. And we wanted to talk to you about how the change in methodology changes maybe the way that your institution and your team is thinking about annual giving. So already we have some responses coming in. Thanks so much for weighing in. We wanted to give you a little bit of variety in how you're thinking about this. So maybe it's yes, and we're less focused, or yes, and actually we're more focused now that we're thinking about it differently. And it could be the other side of that coin as well, which is, nope, nothing changed here. We've never really focused on this as much, or no, this is inspiring us to think about it with refreshed lenses. A perfectly acceptable answer, which it seems many of you are also experiencing, is May wasn't that long ago. We're still trying to wrap our head around this. So still to be determined as we talk with our boards, our volunteers, our institutional leadership. And so I think we're pretty well weighed in here, Lauren, our teammate who's pulling up that poll. I think we can go ahead and call this one that we're all still looking for answers. As you think about this, I think this is a moment when sometimes we show up to sessions like today or to conferences to understand who else is in that same boat. And I think many of you are saying we're all in that same boat together, trying to figure out, what do we do with this shift in information? How do we move forward in a productive and thoughtful way?
Sure. And as we look at the future, thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, you bet.
As we look at the future, we've had a lot of college presidents over the years, when we first get a chance to meet them, say, I'm the new college president. This is important that we rise in the rankings. And alumni giving was certainly a priority for many of those presidents. It was a chance for them to think about how they raise the profile of their institution. It's still going to be important, but we're going to have a slightly different measure for what that means. And let's jump to the next slide if we could. So what the rankings do for us. So some of these, I look at it this way. I see this as a little bit of an opportunity for us to reset the table with these. And I think about it as the historic problem with rankings. So one is I think they created some bad behaviors in development. One of them I call the young alumni schemes. People did them to drive numbers. So what did people do? Just to name a few, I worked for an institution that they had a fee that they charged everybody every year. Students didn't even know they were making a gift as part of their class gift, but they counted them as part of that. Other places, if you haven't heard about this, there was always the trend of one trustee handed everybody $1 as they walked across the stage for graduation, and the development officer was on the other side of the stage. And at the end of it, they handed them the $1 back, and they counted their class as 100% participation. Didn't do anything. We had other places where they had room deposits that students could surrender their room deposits instead of taking those back, which last I saw, they were probably mom and dad's money, but it really didn't do anything. We also know that it did a few other things, that the focus on donor count really didn't look at the right way about were we engaging participation throughout our alumni database? Were we engaging across the spectrum in a lot of different ways, whether men, women, age, graduation timeframe, different majors? It had us just drive a number, and that number kind of masked the real problem that we were starting to lose part of our market share and weren't communicating with our alums in the same way. We also know that it punished institutions that were first generation colleges, notably the HBCUs that heavily carry first generation college students. But those places where students didn't come from wealthy homes tended to not be in a position to make a gift in their first few years out of college. So there was an unnecessary impact on the rankings because of that. And then we also know it was meant to indicate institutional strength, but did it really? I've worked with a couple of universities that both are graduating about 20,000 students a year. Think of the Herculean task of even maintaining a 5 or 10% donor rate when you have 20,000 students a year graduating. So those are all things that have really been historic problems that created some challenges about how we approach this. So we're free of that. So when we look at this, this quote from James, we were talking the other day, and I'm like, we need to share that. And when we're chasing that percentage of alumni donors, it drives institutions to do the things that they may or may not want to do. This does matter. And that's why we have James here with you today. And with that in mind, James, talk to us about why this still matters for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few reasons why this still matters and why it has always mattered beyond the rankings. I'd start by thinking of alumni participation as an indicator of program health. And this is really a big thing for me. It's something that I like to talk with clients a lot about. But it gets overlooked a lot of the time because as Mark was saying, the rankings have kind of masked the real problem here, and they've allowed alumni participation to become the scapegoat. And we've sort of used that as a thing and say, oh, it's bad. We don't want to do alumni participation anymore. I think we've been looking at it all wrong. And alumni participation is, at the end of the day, it's just a metric, and that's it. And it's an indicator of how many alumni are giving to their alma mater. And that's a pretty valuable statistic to pay attention to. The rankings are a different story. The rankings are about comparing yourselves to others. They're about competing for the top spots, and there's this pressure to improve your ranking. And often that would come from outside the advancement office. That may be the president or the board, as Mark was saying. So, we get that. And I'm very sympathetic sometimes towards places that like have no control over that sort of push for alumni participation when it was just about rankings that was coming from somewhere else. But it wasn't really alumni participation as a metric that was sort of leading us down these kind of dark paths, these schemes, right? It wasn't the alumni participation metric that started hiding fees in event registration forms, or the thing of giving the dollar to the student as they walked across the stage. That wasn't an alumni participation. That was all about the rankings. And so, I think our obsession with rankings and our obsession with trying to compete and improve our position, that's what led us down the bad path. It wasn't about alumni participation as a metric. So, I have worked at schools where this was a big deal. And as a BWF consultant, I've had many, many clients who've been in the same boat. And that pressure is coming from outside. It's coming from the very top. So we get it, totally understand it. And I can absolutely sympathize with people who, the day this news came out, their first feeling was a sense of relief. Even as someone who's no longer a practitioner, like who hasn't got that pressure on me every day, even I felt some relief as a sort of PTSD from those years of like, okay, we don't have to worry about it anymore. And it only took a few minutes for me to think, no, that's the wrong way to think about this. It's the rankings that we don't have to worry about. Great. That's not a bad thing. I'm happy about that. I'll do what was the headline? Ding dong, the witch is dead. I'll do the dance. That's happy. I'm celebrating that the rankings are not going to look at this anymore for the most part. But I think the reality is that alumni participation got a bad reputation, and that wasn't entirely deserved, because as a metric, it's still a pretty good indicator of program health. Are you growing? Are you declining? How does your base feel about the direction you're going in? And I think this is a metric where we need to spend less time comparing ourselves to others. In fact, that's probably the first thing I would say to stop doing. Like, stop comparing yourselves to others with this metric. This is an internal thing now. Start looking at your own data. What's been happening in the last 3 to 5 years? Is your participation trend going up or down? And also, we were talking earlier about sometimes schools are graduating more and more students, and so their participation as a percentage rate is kind of unfair, because if they're getting more and more students, their denominator is going up, and they may actually be increasing their number of donors, but their participation rate went down. So again, the rankings kind of unfairly treated schools that were growing. So fair enough. If that's you, like, maybe pay less attention to it as a participation rate and think more about the raw donor count. But still, it's important. I have worked with schools where there's like a nearly 50% decline in their alumni donor count in, a five-year period. And that tells me something's going on there. It tells us that there's probably a messaging and branding issue that needs to be addressed. It tells me there's some sort of engagement issue that needs to be addressed. I think it really tells us that there's a pretty serious disconnect between what you're doing and what your alumni want. And maybe your dollars are going up and you're raising more and more money each year, and you're thinking, it's fine, we're raising more money, we don't need to worry about participation. I don't know if that's going to last forever. And I think if you don't pay any attention to your base, you're going to eventually end up in a bit of a tricky situation here. And so the base really does matter. That's our second point. It's the foundation on which you build your entire program, and it's really about your long-term success. And that's what we should be thinking about as fundraising organizations. I know there's a tendency to think in the short term. There's always pressure to get to the goal this year. Maybe you're thinking about next year. But we have a duty to think a bit longer term now. We have a duty to think about how we're setting up this institution for the future, 10 years from now or more. So when we start working with a school doing some sort of annual giving assessment, the first thing we always ask is, what is the role of annual giving in your advancement program? And we usually hear that, to some extent, revenue is important. That's always a factor. But almost all of the time we hear that annual giving is seen as a pipeline development strategy. So if annual giving is about pipeline and your base is shrinking, that's really not a good thing. That's probably not a great indicator of pipeline. And there's certainly nuance to this, and your base should include more than just alumni. And sometimes it's fair to say that participatory giving is not always a good indicator of future support. And there's things you can do to tweak your annual giving strategy to make sure that you're being a true driver of that pipeline for mid-level and major giving programs. And of course, we'd encourage you to think beyond just alumni, but it doesn't mean you have to overlook alumni altogether. And one of the reasons I want to, highlight of why alumni matter is this lifetime affiliation thing. You cannot overlook how important that is. It's huge. With alumni, you have this constituency who are likely to be deeply connected to you. Sometimes no matter what you do, by the way. And it certainly varies by school. There's a lot of difference to this, a lot of variance to this in the type of organization you are. But for the most part, it's fair to say that alumni have probably spent a few years of their lives, maybe living on campus, maybe not, but either way, a few years of their lives, you were an extraordinary part of a transformative experience that they had, and you're at the absolute core of that. And all of the other fundraising organizations we work with that aren't in higher education, they would do anything for that kind of built-in affinity. And they don't have it. And in higher ed, we do. And alumni tend to have, higher renewal rates than other donors. They tend to have a lower cost of acquisition than other donors. So it's easier to get them to give, and it's more efficient to get them to make that first gift. And then it's easier and more efficient to get them to renew their giving. So that sounds to me like it's pretty much worth our time. We also see that alumni tend to have a longer donor life cycle. So in other sectors, we often see that donors will engage with an organization for a few years, but over a period of time, their interests start to change, their lives get busy, and they end up disengaging, and it kind of ends their relationship sometimes. Whereas in higher education, that affiliation actually lasts a lifetime. And, we see this trend of people in their 20s, sort of the first 10 years out of college, be highly engaged, often giving it at reasonable rates as well. Then they get into their sort of 30s, they're building their families, their careers are taking off, they're getting very, very busy. I call it the life happens curve. And ultimately their engagement drops, their giving drops. For about 20 years, you don't really see a whole lot. But guess what? Later on, as long as you've been doing the work in the background, they come back because they have that lifetime affinity. Whereas other organizations would have lost that person forever. These people come back to us and they become great donors well into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. I think everything else equal, I'd say that alumni have, typically have higher lifetime donor value than non-alumni. So, from my perspective, why does this matter to annual giving teams? I'd put it down to these few things. It's a great indicator of how your base feels about what you're doing. It's a natural constituency for building your base. And honestly, I think that regardless of changes to the rankings and how the methodology behind that, this is still absolutely something that should be on our minds and part of our focus.
Thanks, James. As we're looking at the competitive, one of the challenges I see is that we're going to have to figure out how to make sure that annual giving programs stay properly funded, because there's that immediate reward that existed for folks to fund those programs. When we think about this, there's obviously annual giving growth, but what about the campaign side, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. And it feeds right off of where James left off. One of the things that we sit down and talk to clients about as they're getting started in a campaign is we put together a comprehensive campaign plan. That is beyond just a dollar amount. Maybe I shouldn't say just, it's beyond the dollar amount that we're chasing in that campaign. We ask them to come up with a list of objectives of how do we want to be different as an institution, as an organization, as a team, as a constituency. How do we want to behave differently, look differently, perform differently by the end of this campaign? I was just on site with a client going through this exercise last week, and we were talking about what do we want to do to that donor count on an annual basis over the course of this campaign to do just what James said, to build that base in a responsible, sustainable, productive way to ensure our success down the road as well. All the great work that James and others have done in annual giving is ensuring our current and our future success in a campaign. So in some ways, we need all that work to be done and to continue to be done in a productive way as we're launching into campaign. We also know that campaigns do a great job of inspiring pride. They galvanize our alumni, our contributors, our volunteers, our internal and external partners around what is important in this moment. And so in a way, we'll talk about this here in the next slide, it teaches us as contributors to a cause, to an organization, to an institution, why we need to support and be part of something bigger than ourselves. Because just like a campaign sets out to do, it helps us see a way that we can inclusively join in and accomplish something big together. As we think about priority development, one way that we talk about this sometimes is really pre-selling opportunities. So, okay, let's go back to some campaign communications 101 and all of those direct appeals that are going out through the annual giving program and how they can build campaign success for us, even at the top of the pyramid. So we're getting those messages out in front of so many more eyeballs and prospective donors. We might not be raising money for a building necessarily that's been identified as a campaign priority through that annual giving solicitation, but we're almost using it like a news element, that hook of something here is for us to be proud of as a constituency, as a group. And now we're inviting them to get involved in their own personal way. And that can take place throughout the campaign giving pyramid, from that base building effort that James was talking about, all the way to those most transformational gifts. The past behaviors, the responses, the reactions that we're getting from people over time is data that we collect in order to help us define what is interesting to our donors and to our prospects, and where does that align with the priorities that we have identified as an organization or an institution. So it helps us find that overlap so that we're not guessing what people are going to react to. We know based on history and past behaviors, as well as some forecasting that we can do about future activity, to understand those priorities that we stand the best chance to address, solve, and gain and garner additional support for throughout the course of a campaign. Okay, so James talked a little bit about pipeline development as well. And I think this is where our two stories really overlap quite a bit, but I want to talk about it from a capacity building standpoint. So we have to have a pretty broad group of individuals that we can reach back to and help them elevate the way that they're thinking about philanthropy in order to be successful at the top end of that campaign pyramid. So those stories that are told in annual giving and during those base building efforts, that affiliation that we have built, we have fostered, and we have nurtured and stewarded over time, plays into the reputation that we're looking to share, the priorities that we're looking to promote, and then it increases the likelihood of greater understanding by those who are willing to step up and say yes in the moment of campaign, the height of the campaign messaging. So I wanted to dig in just a little bit deeper to talk about that institutional reputation. I love that second bullet point, and I talk to people, especially when we're talking to volunteer groups, that we're looking to help us do peer-to-peer fundraising or to identify individuals that we might be missing. And we might be missing an opportunity with, is that people like us do things like this. And that's part of that reputation building. That's one of the reasons that we need to bring more people in, because that participation does have the power to influence. And as I look even to my own alma mater, those who I graduated with are now making those significant gifts, and they're growing and maturing along the donor pipeline, and along that continuum. And so as we see our peers doing things, that can be motivating to us to build the confidence to elevate our thinking about how we invest in an institution or an organization. The second point, we all have someone that we can think about that is a great example of this. Okay, so mine was an alumni board chair, a spokesperson on a giving day, served on a campaign cabinet, was a big force to be reckoned with when it came to an organizational gift in the workplace. But those people who say yes to many things are more likely to continue to grow in their affiliation with the organization. There was a study done just a few years ago talking about how $1 million plus donors, they almost all claimed to have at least 7 connections to the cause, the institution, or the organization that they made that gift to. We talked to academic leaders about this statistic quite a bit, because we can make some assumptions based on where someone graduated from or what they've given to in the past. But we also have to understand that if we grow that engagement with the institution, we elevate the likelihood of a larger commitment down the road. This is also a tool that we use to talk about priority development. And every step along this arrow is very important. I want to call special attention to that center one today. But we think about this as the difference between priorities that have been lifted up maybe through our case for support and targets of opportunity that could even be donor-led. Someone comes to us with something they really want to do or invest in, and they're willing to put the capital behind that. I want to go to the priority from the institutional level. This is something that's aligned with our strategic plan, our vision that we've set forth for our organization. Who's that subject matter expert? That's that campus champion. But where we want to focus today is building that natural donor constituency. So all of those good behaviors, those past ideas and present ideas that we're putting in front of individuals, as they react, respond, and, word of the day, participate, we build those natural constituencies that we can test priorities with later. We can go to market with these ideas with confidence that we're going to have a donor body, a donor constituency that is willing to support that cause. We know that there's overlap when it comes to donor interests and institutional priority. So these are just a couple of things that I think are important to think about in the campaign context, and how they connect back to our activity within the annual giving program and driving that participation, monitoring that participation in a consistent way, so we have that data to go back to. So we're going to toss it back to Mark here, so we can kind of set the stage for where do we go from here.
Yeah, so the great opportunity is, years ago, annual giving meant unrestricted. We've crossed that bridge long ago, that very few annual giving programs are purely unrestricted. And we've seen donors step forward and say, I want to support scholarship. I want to support athletics. I want to support laboratory sciences. Where do we go from here, James? How do we make sure that we can make sure there's the right ROI here with annual giving?
Yeah, and I think what is exciting to me about this summer is it's been an opportunity for many schools to sort of hit a big reset button and say, all right, let's take a step back and think about, what are we doing here? We know that we're going to have an annual giving program, and we just need to reevaluate what matters, what's really important. So actually, I'm going to skip to my second bullet point here to start off with, but sorry, we can stay on that slide. Thank you. I'd start by evaluating your objectives and your metrics, and keeping in mind they're not the same thing. They're not one and the same. So set out what your goals and objectives are for your annual giving program, so that you can figure out, like, how does it fit into the larger advancement operation? Is it all about bringing in unrestricted revenue, or even partially restricted or fully restricted revenue? Is that all it is, and it's just about the dollars raised, which for some schools it is? Or are you a pipeline development shop? Are you trying to build for the future? And there's not a right or wrong answer on that. It comes down to institutional need. But then evaluate what those metrics are. And I think that it's very important for places to have, here's our goal, this is the main thing that we're measured against, but also these are the other metrics that we're going to look at that we're maybe not incentivized to hit in the same way, but the things we're going to pay attention to. So we were talking about program health earlier, and just to clarify on that, the reason participation is a good indicator of program health is because you're looking at your own data over time, and it's the trend line that matters, right? Are you getting better or worse? And it's for the same reason that things like retention rates can matter. So if you're comparing yourselves, you've got, a smaller Ivy League school may have a 30-40% alumni participation rate. And then you've got a large growing public university, and they may have a 7% alumni participation rate. Yeah, I mean, that's in itself, that's not a good measure of program health. But if the Ivy League school is seeing a decline every year, and they're dropping by a few percentage points, and their denominator is not getting any bigger, and the public university, the denominator is getting bigger each year, but they're actually seeing gains, that's why that's an indicator of program health. Retention rate is huge. I always put that as sort of the first thing that we should be paying attention to, even if it's not part of your actual objectives. And think carefully about how retention rate is affected by gift amount. So what we typically see I always think, look at your counts of donors at different metric levels as well. So I like to look at $1,000 and $100 as two kind of key levels of giving. What we typically see is when donors are giving at $100 or more in a year, those retention rates climb into the 60% range. So whereas the sort of higher ed benchmarks in the sort of 45% range certainly can go a little lower than that, can go a little higher than that, but that's what we usually see with our clients when we do our data work. Get to a $100 donor, that can climb into the 60s. That $1,000 donor is going to renew in the 80% range, sometimes even higher than that. So those are great. So not just looking just solely at the number of donors, but at donors at those metric levels of $100 and $1,000. Think about your retention rates and how they're affected. Also, sometimes we call this penetration rate, but it's kind of the number of alumni, percentage of alumni who are giving every 3 to 5 years. It doesn't necessarily matter how many alumni are giving every single year, because for some people that's just not the way that they're engaging with you. If you have a large group of people who give but sort of infrequently, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's going to be a much higher percentage obviously than the number of people who give every single year. So what we like everyone to give often, and that can be a great indicator of future support. I actually would say that how many people are giving every 3 to 5 years is probably a really good thing to look at as well. And then starting to see more and more schools look at lifetime donor value. I think this is a bit of an emerging trend. It's, some people have been doing this for a while, but I think it's really important when you start to think about if we're a pipeline development shop and we're building for the future. A lot of places want to measure ROI, but they're defining that return, the R, as what's happening this year. It's kind of the wrong way to look at it. If you're a pipeline development shop, your ROI really needs to be defined by how are you building for the future. And so lifetime donor value is a good way to do that. There are a few different ways that you could calculate that. Some are highly complex, but there's some fairly simple ways to do that. Ultimately, an indicator or a predictor of how long a donor will stay giving to the organization and how much they'll give during that time. So again, remember that metrics and goals are not the same thing. You certainly want metrics around your goals, but it's important to look at other things as well to really have a sense of how well you're doing and if the strategies you have in place are the right things. So beyond that, I think expanding your audience, and this has been one of the sort of downfalls we've seen around alumni participation, that people have. We actually could just go back to the previous slide. Sorry, Michelle. So we've had a little bit too much focus on undergraduate alumni. So we got graduate alumni with graduate degrees. There's schools that have highly engaged parents who would be great prospects. There's schools that have great faculty and staff campaigns, employee giving campaigns. Then there's non-alumni, and that's huge. Some of the larger public schools I work with, they have more non-alumni donors than alumni donors. And so you don't want to overlook that group of people. An important piece here is to make sure that you're segmenting appropriately and treating these audiences different. You can't just put together an alumni giving program and then go out and expect that to work for all your other audiences. You need to build strategies that are designed for those specific audiences in mind. And James, you need to update your messaging.
This is a really important part, though, is that the audience, alumni participation may decline, but the total raw number of donors should not be declining. That is a trend as an industry we need to reject, and we need to drive hard to build our donor numbers should not be declining. That's an important piece about expanding that audience.
Absolutely. And the reality is it's easy to, look at industry data and just think it's okay and to say like, well, look, everyone's declining, we don't need to worry about it. That's the wrong way, because there are nonprofit charitable organizations that are increasing their donor counts. There's a lot of them actually. So it is possible. You need to be doing things the right way and focusing on like building those long-term relationships, earning trust, building engagement. Then your donor counts shouldn't be declining. And if they are, I think that's when it's an indicator that we're kind of doing something wrong. Mark mentioned at the beginning, sometimes part of the ask of the annual fund came to be, you should give because it will help our rankings. And I think that was a pretty successful way to ask. It sounds a little funny from the outside, but actually like a lot of schools did testing around that and found it was a pretty effective way to get those gifts. If that's what you've been doing, okay, fair enough. But obviously you're going to need to update your messaging from there. I would say beyond that, we got a little lazy with the messaging. And what I mean by that is that we tended to rely on the fact that loyalty was a given and that people wanted to give to their alma mater, and we were just going to take that for granted. People would give out a sense of obligation. I feel on some institutions that was true at some point in time. I just don't think it's true for most places anymore, and we're going to have to work a little bit harder to earn their trust and build the awareness, work on the education piece, talk about impact more, talk about community more. I think impact's important at the base level, but community is just as important. Helping people understand how they are belonging to a group of like-minded individuals who are sort of share their vision for making the world a better place. That's the kind of thing that inspires donors to take action and keeps them engaged for a longer period of time. And then if we can just jump to the next slide, I want to talk about the fundraising funnel, the ACE model that we use a lot. Ultimately here, the thought is we need to be investing more time and resources in effective donor experience management, because what we see is when we ask donors why they stopped giving to organizations, it always comes down to like the experience they had, like not feeling like their support was noticed or appreciated, not feeling like it made a difference in any way. The same reasons why people continue to give and give for long periods of time is because they had a really great experience as a donor. So I think this is something that we shouldn't, we cannot give too much attention to this. We're pretty good in annual giving programs at the middle of the funnel. I call this engagement. I know like that can be a complicated term, but the part where we ask people for money, we're pretty good at that. We can send out appeals all day long. We can do some great things with email and with digital appeals. We don't spend enough time, generalizing a little bit here, but I think it's true for a lot of places. We do not spend enough time at the top of the funnel raising awareness, talking about why philanthropy is important, connecting the dots for donors, attracting new people in and inspiring them to take action. We also don't spend enough time at the bottom of the funnel, driving that loyalty, making them feel their support was noticed and they're appreciated. We need to get a lot better at the top and the bottom of the funnel. I think our donors' expectations have changed over time. They are having these elevated experiences with brands that are not their sort of nonprofits that they give to, but other brands they interact with. And that's changed the way they think about how their experience should be with us. They're curated content, personalized engagement. And this is the kind of work that we need to be doing. So some of the stuff we've been doing with clients is thinking about recognition to renewal journeys. So mapping out everything that happens when somebody makes a gift for the next 12 to 18 months. How are we engaging with them? Who is speaking to them right after that gift? And what are they saying? When are we preparing them for their next ask? When is that ask going to happen? That's how we can drive really solid retention rates, by building up really good donor experience management. And those will, over time, that's what will drive our participation and make sure that we're sort of building for the future. So you can use technology to automate some of that. I don't know that we're at a point for most institutions that you can automate all of it. And there's always some kind of tools that we have to work through there. But ultimately, you can create a version of this, even if it's fairly simple. It's a philosophy for how you think about annual giving. It's this sort of engagement-led approach. So yeah, I'll pass that back to Michelle to hear from her.
Yeah, I would just build on one.
Oh, I think Mark was going to chime in. Sorry.
Nope, sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
We're going to come back after Michelle's done talking a little bit about the campaign impact. We want to talk a little bit about how this compares to alumni engagement more broadly. But let's talk about what the impact is on campaigns.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. One point, James, I'd like to make in support of your great bullet points there is talking about that impact of giving really at all gift valuations. Sometimes I think we do a really good job at the very top of our pyramid, especially during a campaign, talking about that $1 million, $5 million, $10 million donor who made this difference, the impact that gift made. But also telling those stories, certainly in the annual giving program, is important for us to make that impact accessible for everybody who wants to participate. So I appreciate that point. Thinking about so now what for alumni participation when it comes to campaigns? Okay, so alert, obvious comment of the day. James certainly touched on this, but I will reiterate. Internal performance metrics are important. Alumni participation data, it does provide us with that internal benchmark to gauge the success of our overall fundraising efforts. It helps us set those campaign goals. It helps us monitor our progress against those objectives that we talked about earlier and evaluate the effectiveness of engagement strategies overall. But the word that I think is maybe even most important there is consistently. So think about some of the things Mark talked about early in our hour together about some of the games that we played, soft credit, hard credit. There was a lot of discussion about that. Think about all the conversations that your external team and your annual fund team have had with advancement services about how we're going to track this, the operational challenges that created. Those operational challenges and the inconsistency that sometimes we have treated this topic with, that impacts our ability to handle additional volume in a campaign. So from a strategy to even the most tactical examples, that consistency and the way that we monitor this over time, we track it, we talk about it with our volunteers, our boards, that's really important to the long-term success of our campaigns and for us to be able to report on those successes and the transparency that we all strive to have with our donors, our volunteers, internal and external partners as well. Certainly, using that data to make strategic data-focused decisions cannot be underscored enough. Tracking our participation, it allows us to make the informed decisions about where do we allocate those resources when we're talking about a campaign budget. As we think about the strategies that are going to be necessary for successful campaign success, when we're thinking about all of those objectives, including the significant dollar goal, those data points that we've tracked over time are going to be important to us to help figure out how do we target the individuals that we are targeting, how do we target those messages for effective outreach, and understanding which initiatives we need to lead with to increase participation in that campaign as well. We can optimize our fundraising approach by focusing on things that we know are going to appeal to our donor base. Thinking about the effectiveness of engagement is maybe not something we think about in a campaign context every day, but tracking that participation over time can reveal those trends. So think about how we were talking about that priority development, pre-selling those ideas, building confidence internally about what we can really take to market and do well with from a campaign perspective. We often sit down with clients and say, okay, if someone comes in and gives you $100 million tomorrow toward nothing that's within your case, have we really solved a problem? So thinking about how have our donors behaved in the past? Which types of events, programs, communications have led to that higher participation can help us shape that campaign narrative, sharpen that case for support, and really helps us connect with donors at an impact level, helping them find a way to join us, and so that together we can solve the bigger problem. We do that all through understanding what our alumni have done, and it builds confidence in what they will continue to do moving forward. So I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for questions here, Mark. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the campaign related recommendations there, and hopefully we can dig into a few more with questions.
Great. And one of the consistent themes you're hearing from James and Michelle is this is really the largest relationship management tool of the entire institution.
Yeah.
So as we're thinking about how we're communicating messages, James, Michelle, be interested, how does this interface with the alumni engagement metrics from CASE and other places? Where does the annual giving plug into the total engagement measurement of how alums are connected?
James, you want to lead off there?
Sure. So what I like about the CASE alumni engagement metric is that it is a much more holistic measure of engagement. And so giving is a component of it, and there's a lot more things that we're looking at as well. And that is a worthy thing to do. And I think there's some inherent problems with the tracking for some schools. I think it's easy for some schools with all the technology they have to track that, and others struggle a little bit more to track as many components as there are in that methodology. But it's a good idea, and we should encourage schools to use that, or a version of that. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but I would not advocate for US News adopting the case alumni engagement score as part of their rankings. I think we should be moving beyond rankings, because if we do that, we're just going to end up right where we were again, because you can manipulate that score just like you could your annual giving percentage, right? You can come up with ways to make your number bigger and bigger, because it's all going to get about competing with others. So personally, I don't know that we want to be in that game anymore. I think we're better off without it. I think we should be using the alumni engagement score again more as an internal measure, and it's fine to benchmark and to see how you compare to other institutions that you feel are in your sort of peer and aspirant groups, as long as you just don't take that too seriously, don't get too carried away with that. But ultimately, like, use this as an internal metric of, are you doing the right things? And again, it can be about program health. It can be, are you ready for a campaign? If is your alumni engagement numbers trending positively and telling you that your base is supporting you?
One of the things I think is really helpful about the case framework that's been put together is it gave us a place to start. And we think about it in those 4 categories that Case has outlined, which is communications, that experiential engagement, participation or giving, and then volunteer. And what I'm seeing with some of the clients that we're working with right now is people feel pretty confident in how they're tracking the giving, the participation portion of that. That's a data point that we've been able to start with confidence. I might even say, for those that have mature event programs and a great tracking system for that, that's been another place where we can count a win there and go to our board and say, we're doing pretty well compared to where we were last year from an experiential engagement standpoint, especially now that we're a little bit past some of the height of the pandemic. I think the 2 areas where I see institutions really kind of scratching their heads and digging in on how are we going to track and monitor this effectively over time is in that communications category and in that volunteerism category. Sometimes we've tracked maybe board participation, but if we're thinking about advisory boards that at the unit level, maybe for our larger universities, our alumni boards, our giving circles, things like that, defining how we talk about that volunteerism at our institution. To your point, James, comparing myself in that category to another institution is likely not going to be helpful. Instead, if I want to grow that body of volunteers at my institution, I have to think about how I want to define that, how it's important to the programs that we have, and how I'm going to do that consistently over time. The same thing for communications. We can call just about anything that we do within any of our programs communications, but what are those key pieces that we want to be able to track and repeat? So what I've been talking to our clients who are looking to embrace that case engagement scorecard is to think about how in those categories that you're finding it more challenging, how do you start small, think big, move fast? So pick a couple of pieces that you want to track over time. Maybe you do a really consistent alumni engagement newsletter. You want to see who that's getting in front of, and you're trying to get some response, some two-way communication. So thinking about how do we continue to embrace that model, but to do it in a way that doesn't overwhelm us from a volume perspective, so that we end up with those inconsistencies down the road.
Yeah, Michelle hit on a real important topic there, was picking the metrics that matter for your institution. Every place is a little unique. And I would just encourage that as part of that, though, is be consistent, is don't have them change from quarter to quarter, from year to year. About those things need to be a constant. And that's why picking those metrics properly is important for making sure you're doing the right things for your program. Another question here is, can you talk a little bit about the raising awareness part of the giving funnel? And is there a good way to measure that?
Yeah, of course. So, some of the ways you can do this is through things like a content marketing strategy, making sure that you're spending a lot of time or an appropriate amount of time telling stories, communicating with alumni and other donors without necessarily just always asking for their support. You can certainly do this through other engagement opportunities, things like events as well. But I think that content is a big piece of this that is often sort of the overlooked part. Most of our marketing materials and our content that we do, most of that is actually just appeals, asking people for their gifts. So I would always advocate for, like, let's think bigger than that. Think about a more holistic marketing strategy. In terms of measuring that, two ways that come to mind. One is, there's a lot of ways to measure digital engagement through things. So, you use things like your email open rates and click rates, accounting for some of the, last couple of years of changes in how that data is being tabulated. You can still see your apples to apples comparison sort of over time. Are you doing the right things? Are you making that engagement go up? And also by simply asking people how they feel as well. And, Alex Softley, who leads our decision science practice, has done a lot of work in this space where it's found that how alumni feel or how donors feel is actually a better indicator of their likelihood to support than the things they do on paper, like their actual, participating in engagement things. How they feel is very important. So we would advocate for asking donors and alumni on a fairly consistent basis, are we doing the right things? Are we communicating with you in an effective way? Ultimately, they'll tell you. And then you can take from that if the strategies you have in place are being effective or not. And like everything, it's a longitudinal study. You have to see, you do one round of data and that's great. That's one thing, but you need to see, are you building over time?
I want to merge a couple questions here together. As we think about one of the risks here is that maybe moving away from creative accounting or just the way the market's trending is some places we'll either see or fear a decline in participation, fewer donor counts. Any thoughts about, reversing that trend, how to manage expectations and where there may be at least a temporary decline? How do we manage that at our institutions and get a handle on why we're losing donors?
So if I'm going to break that into two pieces, I think I'll do my best. So I don't want to understate how difficult that conversation can be to go to the president or the board and say, we lost donors this year and it's okay. It's a good thing. We're building for the future. Don't worry. Like, I get it. That's going to be a complicated thing. Now, ideally, you're in an environment where you have the buy-in and the support of the leadership, whether that's the president or the board or whatever. And again, I think you separate out the rankings piece and that becomes less important. If you are raising the money and you're doing all the right things and you're talking about the long-term strategy, hopefully that group of people gets on board and says, yeah, we support you. We know you're doing the right things. What was the second part of the question was around, like,
how do we reverse that trend? How do we get those donor counts climbing again?
And so I think that you have to think about it as it's not an overnight fix. And some of that, let's be honest, gimmicky stuff we were doing, those sort of quick wins, that transactional stuff, if you cut all of that out and you lose those donors, then you're not just going to immediately see these like increases next year. That's why I've talked about like hitting the reset button. And we really should allow ourselves to let's look at what our participation really is of donors who are actually making philanthropic gifts, not transactional stuff they didn't even know they were doing. Then we're building from the base and we're building from the ground up. And I'm not pretending any of this is easy, but if we focus on doing all of the basics right, so telling the right stories, talking about the impact we can make, talk about the community that you can belong to, we use the tools that are increasingly available and more accessible to meet people where they are, to engage them in the spaces where they're spending their lives. It's all very possible to do that. There's examples out there of a few in higher education, but more so outside higher ed, that are really doing all of the right things, and they are gaining donors every year. They're getting more and more support, and they are growing. And those are the kind of strategies that we need to replicate.
And I don't think we can underscore enough the need for stewardship at this level of the funnel as well. that impact storytelling, even for those unrestricted gifts that you are working double time probably to be able to secure. Why is it that gift is important to your institution, and continuing to unapologetically tell that story over and over again about the time that we're at the institution sick of telling that story is just about the time that our constituents are starting to hear it. So that stewardship really needs to be a key focus of each of our programs, and at every level, I would say, of that funnel.
Yeah, and I would add that stewardship COVID sped a lot of things up. Pre-COVID, we had our non-educational clients that were national, I think, did a better job of digital engagement and stewardship, because they didn't have all the traditional trappings of homecoming mugs and different stuff. And during COVID, they just got better at it. And being able to anticipate what's going to happen to our numbers, I think, builds credibility for you as a practitioner to be able to say, we're anticipating a decline because we're changing something, but it's temporary. We understand what's happening. Hey, I know we're almost at the end of time here. Any parting thoughts, Michelle, James?
I would just say this is a conversation I think we need to continue to engage in as an industry and as practitioners and consultants alike. There is no likely easy answer on what comes next. It's going to take a lot of thought leadership on all of our parts to understand, how do we do this in a way that is going to ensure long-term organizational or institutional success. We talk about the leadership transitions that are happening so frequently, especially in higher education shops right now. And we will not be here likely in 20 years as maybe the profession led us to believe, to ensure that continued success. And so how do we set those who are in our seats next up for success with our donors to ensure we have a bright future? So I think it's going to take some ongoing consideration on all of our parts.
Great.
We're not done yet.
Yeah. Well, while we're wrapping up, can we slide to the last slide here?
Oh, sure.
This slide will do one of two things. It will either allow you to do a group order to Jimmy John's, or do a webinar feedback. We always appreciate your feedback. James, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I would just say, look, this is an opportunity. It's not in the threat column. There's so much that we can do here, so much work we have to do. It's time to get back to it and start focusing on the right things, hit that reset button, and think about what these kind of annual giving programs can become when we do it for all the right reasons.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time today, and feel free to reach out to any of us for follow-up, and look forward to seeing you all somewhere at a conference or a campus near you.